slush here in peace. Man, Sue, you make me feel so short.
Yes.
You know, when I first read the Journal of Best Practices, I recognized in David Finch's description of himself some of the people that I have loved and respected over the years. In fact, as I read the book, the 4 years I spent living in a single family house with 3 other adult men started to make a lot of sense to me. At the time, I found 2 of them to be really confounding. The thing that was funny is that the 2 of them were always misunderstanding each other. And what was particularly confounding was the fact that they seemed to hardly ever even notice each other. They never interacted, despite the fact that they lived in the same house and worked in the same small company. And there was no animosity there. It just, I don't know, they just didn't connect at all. And one of them was a brilliant biophysicist who never looked me in the eye when he spoke to me, or anyone else for that matter. He would look up at the ceiling as he spoke, every time he spoke, and he would be completely oblivious to social cues that most of us just take for granted. Once in a while, he would call me at work to ask me about dinner plans or the water heater or something. And he would just be talking and talking, and the phone would be ringing, then I'd have to answer it, and I would scream at him over and over again that I had to put him on hold. And he didn't hear me, so I would put him on hold, I would take care of business, I'd come back 5 minutes later, and he would still be talking. And then when he paused for a breath, I would tell him that I had left and come back, and he would say, "Oh, I hadn't noticed," and he would just continue with what he was saying, as if I had caught every single word of the story that he was telling me. And the thing is that this happened all the time. And the other person, the other man in that house, was my partner. In the 18 years we were together, we never really quite got each other. I mean, we loved each other fiercely, like David Finch and his wife, Kristen, but it was always just sort of missing each other. I'm a big picture kind of guy, and I'm really good at spatial relationships and group dynamics and abstract ideas. And he's all about the tangible world, small details. He's the master of the vignette. Whenever we moved, I would unpack 26 boxes of kitchen equipment and put it all away and wash it, and while he lovingly arranged on one shelf 14 objects from 12 different boxes, things that had never been together before, but were arranged with devastating artistry. And the thing is that arranging things in our house, in these little micro scenes, were that was the thing that just gave him life. Often when I'd get home after him, he'd greet me at the door and excitedly say, "Did you see what I did?" I really did love those 2 guys. I still love them. But it confused the heck out of me to live with them. They were like David Finch. I could ask them 10 times a day to close the pantry door so the cat wouldn't get in, and they would never close the pantry door. But a complete stranger could ask them to do anything, absolutely anything, and they would just do it. One time, one of them came home from work 3 hours late, sharing the story of driving a complete stranger to the airport. Not the airport nearby in San Francisco, but the one an hour and a half away in Sacramento. And he never even got her name. Years after our household split up, I realized that they may have Asperger's syndrome. Now, I should note here that since the publication of the Journal of Best Practices and that revelation, clinicians have stopped using the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome as something separate. And instead, they talk about the autism spectrum, knowing that there are no fixed points on that spectrum, and that each individual is so different that trying to pin any set of behaviors on one point is really counterproductive. So it's all just spectrum now. Anyway, understanding just a tiny bit of the spectrum at that point, it just gave me so much more compassion. Compassion I wish I'd had while I lived with them. And understanding helped me to see that they were just different from me, right? They weren't bad, they weren't wrong, they weren't sick or broken. They were just different from me and different from each other, and they had about as much chance of changing as I did. And I realized that while I was living with them, no amount of explaining or pleading would change them or their behaviors. I realized that they didn't behave the way they did just to be annoying. And more importantly, I learned that their behaviors didn't have to define them. I also learned that while it seemed to me that they didn't interact with each other, they just did it in a way that I didn't really understand. And that was my limitation, not theirs. Living with the two of them was my first experience in understanding neurodiversity. And by neurodiversity, I mean the range of differences in individual brain function and behavioral traits that are regarded as part of a normal variation in humans. They are every bit as normal as I am. The term neurodiversity is probably most often used in the context of describing people on the autism spectrum, but it can also refer to differences in our emotional or intellectual abilities, or even the psychiatric conditions we live with, especially a tendency to depression or conditioned responses to traumatic events in our past, what we commonly call PTSD. The term neurodiversity is an inclusive linguistic acknowledging that our brain function is as varied as the physical characteristics of our bodies. The way our brains function and perceive the world is as varied as the rest of the things about us. We all experience some kind of physical change at some point, right? Like losing vision or losing hearing or mobility. And we can lose those things either permanently or temporary. You know, like we can have allergies or autoimmune issues that can also come and go. And it's all perfectly normal. We're all changing. We're all different at different points. Likewise, we can have periods of depression or loneliness or trauma that can affect our behaviors and our perceptions. And if those periods are long enough, they can change the way that our brains function over the long term. That's the thing that I find really fascinating. So my biophysicist housemate and his psychologist husband, who is also a housemate, often referred to these kinds of differences as hardwiring. And I think that's a great term. And the thing about it is that, you know, most of the time, most of us can work with whatever we've got. We can cover up things that we feel weird about in the interest of looking vaguely normal, whatever that is. But some of us can't cover it up. The characteristics are just so strong and permanent. And that's okay, that's perfectly normal. So we have to remember that while, you know, I might be able to just get over it, whatever it is, there are some people who just can't. They just are the way they are. So, you know, as I thought about today's service, I thought about asking a variety of folks in the congregation to talk about the ways in which they're wired differently from most other people. But I started thinking about who I could ask, thinking about different people in the congregation. I realized that everybody in the congregation is wired differently from most other people in some way, including me. You know, there are those of us who are nearsighted or farsighted. There's introverts and extroverts. There's the chronically cranky and the persistently positive. I'm not even talking about all of the ways in which our mobility and senses have all been affected in some way. And the thing is, I didn't want anybody to have a label that would hang over them for the rest of time, right? That's not really fair to anybody. I wanted to remember that we're all constantly changing, and that our experiences change, and our experiences change us, and aging changes us and changes our wiring. The reality, though, is that these differences in hard wiring affect our behaviors and our experiences. These differences in hard wiring affect our perception and our expectations. And these differences affect how we are in relationship with each other, even here in this congregation. Here in this congregation, because of their hard wiring, some people crave silence and could sit in stillness for our whole time together, while others can barely stand more than 30 seconds of silent meditation. Some come alive listening to a long, well-researched, scholarly talk on a philosophical or theological fine point, while others fall dead asleep in their chairs listening to a boring lecture. Then when your minister shares stories, whether they're charming personal anecdotes or universal moral tales, some are on the edge of their seats, enthralled, while others are on the edge of their seats ready to bolt out the door. In every congregation I've served, there's been at least one person, almost always a woman, who is described as glowing. And she comes to church for one reason. She lives alone, and it's the only time of the week when she can touch another person. And there's nothing aggressive or sexual about the touch. It's just a hug or a gentle handshake or a hand on the back. But she needs that physical contact now that she lives alone after a life of caring for a husband and children and grandchildren. And in every single congregation I've served, there's also been numerous people of all genders who are survivors of violence. Their personal experiences of violence, like rape or emotional abuse or systematic racial oppression, or serving the military or corrections. Then there's the way in which all of us witness large-scale violence, like war, genocide, even regressive laws and politics that affect all of us to some varying degree. Now, some of us are able to just kind of power through situations like that by focusing on the good, while others can become too overwhelmed to function. Just think about the effects of the 2016 presidential election, the pandemic, the January 6th attacks on the Capitol, the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th. Every one of us reacted in our own unique ways. Some were devastated. Some seemed to take things in stride. And when you look at all of these events, most of us across events fell into both categories. Sometimes we were devastated. Sometimes we motored through. It depended on the situation. And generally, the closer something hits to home, the more affected we are. Generally, but not always. There are many among us living with post-traumatic stress responses that are invisible to the rest, but that limit our mobility or limit our ability to connect with others. So the thing that I find saddest about all of this is that the woman who needs to come to church, the person who needs to come to church just to get physical contact, can trigger the post-traumatic stress response of another person simply by touching them. That's the part that's really devastating to me. Simply joining hands can feel like an assault to one person and like a lifeline to another person. It's also complicated that in a community like this, as in our own families, we sometimes need little reminders that if we're to be as radically welcoming as we want to be, we must meet people where they are, as they are, recognizing the huge variety in our abilities, needs, and expectations, especially in times of conflict. And I don't know if you've noticed, but we are living in times of universal conflict. The last 7 years or so have felt like one giant global stressor after another. And each of us responds in our own ways based on our own hardwiring and our own experiences. So on this first Sunday of the year, when we have the opportunity to just kind of reset everything, including our expectations and behaviors, during this month when we're focusing on liberating love as our theme, I'd like to offer a bit of advice for making your experience here in this covenantal community more satisfying for yourself and others, hopefully more loving. First, we all have to accept that even though we are mostly liberal white folks with gray hair and glasses, we have among us people of multiple ages and races and theologies and politics and physical abilities and personal experiences, all of which affect how we are in relationship with each other. And all of those differences affect our potential for connection. Some connections are easier than others, and that's okay. Just remember that nobody wants to be annoying. We all act the only way that we know how. And if someone is testing your patience, remember that you are testing somebody else's patience too. You are, I guarantee it. It's unavoidable. Such is life in a diverse world. I also want to remind you, and I know that you know this already, don't assume what the limitations of other people are. Ask before you help. Ask, may I open that door for you? Or is it okay if I pick that up? And give them a chance to respond, because you know they may very well say no thank you. Ask when you need help, especially here in this congregation where there are so many people waiting to be helpful. We're trying to cultivate an environment in which people can respond to one another's needs lovingly and compassionately so we can deepen connections, right? But nobody can help you if we don't know what your needs are. Ask before you touch someone. Either hugging them or taking their hand or even helping them to sit down or stand up. You don't want to hurt or trigger anyone unknowingly. And be clear about your own needs. Don't just assume that others will pick up on your subtle hints because they're polite or universally understood. Here's an example. If you're talking to someone who is in your personal space, rather than backing up a step and they keep moving towards you until you hit the wall, just tell them, I would feel more comfortable if you would stand further away. And you can hold up your hand and back up just to demonstrate what that space looks like. It's also perfectly okay to say something like, I need you to not talk over me. And see what I did there? I didn't say, you need to stop talking, right? I said, I need you to not talk over me. Because if you say you need to stop talking, that person could very easily think, no, I don't. I could talk all day. What are you talking about? It's important that you state your needs as your own without projecting them onto the other person. You are ultimately responsible for your own boundaries. So it's actually good if you can state your boundaries clearly. And you get extra points if you can do it in a way that is friendly and cheerful. And even though it may seem weird to say a lot of these things, when you do, I guarantee you that you will find that 99% of the time the response will be, oh, okay. Or I didn't know. Or maybe even, gee, I'm sorry. Because some people like David Finch, like my former housemate and a whole lot of other people that you encounter every day, just need clarity about what the expectations are. because they find them confusing. They want to do the right thing, but they can't pick up on the subtle cues, and no amount of explaining will ever change that. So during this month, when we're thinking about liberating love and the transformational power it can have for us personally and in our congregation, let's do what we can to be more welcoming and more accepting of everyone just as they are, shall we? Let's pay attention to our different hardwiring, let go of annoyance, and ask how we can be helpful, and ask when we need help. But most of all, let's do our best to be really clear about our own needs, even when they seem obvious. So please rise now in body or in